At my father's funeral, I found my wife with her affair partner. My reaction shocked everyone. I remember the silence more than anything else. Not the kind that fills a room when people don't know what to say, but the kind that sits on your chest and makes every breath feel like it's being borrowed. I stood near the front row of chairs, hands clasped together so tightly my knuckles had gone pale, staring at the coffin that held my father. People moved around me, but their footsteps felt muted, as if the whole world had agreed to walk a little softer that day. Maybe they understood the weight of it, or maybe I was the one who couldn't hear properly through the fog inside my head. My father always said that grief doesn't arrive loudly, it settles like dust. And as I stood there trying to grasp the finality of that wooden box, it was settling everywhere, in my thoughts, in my throat, in the ache behind my eyes. I kept waiting to feel something sharp, something piercing. But all I felt was numb, a thick, heavy numbness that made everything look distant, even though I was right there in the middle of it. People came up to me, relatives, family friends, neighbors who'd known my father long before I understood the world. Their hands touched my shoulders. Their voices whispered condolences I barely processed. I nodded because that's what you do, even when your mind is somewhere else entirely, even when your heart refuses to move. I tried to focus on the flowers arranged around his portrait, on the soft glow of the candles, on the familiar faces filling the hall. I thought if I held on to those details, maybe the moment would feel real. But the truth is, nothing felt real. Not the prayers, not the quiet sobbing, not even the sight of my father's name etched on the plaque. It felt like I was watching someone else's life unravel, not my own. But even through that emotional numbness, my eyes kept drifting, almost involuntarily, toward a memory I hadn't allowed myself to process yet. Something I'd seen just minutes before the service began. Something that had cut through the fog and left a mark on me far deeper than any condolence ever could. It's strange how the mind works, how it can hold grief in one hand and something entirely different, something sharp, something confusing, in the other. Standing there surrounded by mourning, my heart wasn't just heavy because of my father. It was carrying something else, something I didn't have the words for yet. The silence in that hall wasn't just about loss. It was the quiet before another truth, one I hadn't shared with anyone. And as much as I tried to bury it under the weight of the moment, it kept rising, pushing against the numbness. Because the truth is, that day didn't break me for just one reason. It wasn't only my father I was losing. There was something else, something I saw, standing right there at his funeral. Something that changed everything. My father wasn't a man who spoke in long sentences. He believed the most important things should be said simply, without decoration. Maybe that's why his last words to me felt so heavy, even though they were only a handful. I remember sitting beside his hospital bed, the rhythmic beeping of the machines filling the room like a second heartbeat. The air smelled of sanitizers and something faintly metallic, but beneath all of that was the quiet presence of a man who had shaped my entire life. He looked smaller that day, as if the illness had taken pieces of him 1 week at a time. But his eyes, those stayed the same, calm, steady, always observing more than he said out loud. When he reached for my hand, it wasn't dramatic or trembling. It was simply firm, the way he'd always been. He told me to stay true to yourself, and even then, I didn't realize how much those words would echo in the days that followed. I wish I had said more. I wish I had told him that I wasn't as strong as he thought, that I wasn't ready to let him go, that I still needed him to tell me how to navigate life when everything gets complicated. But instead, I sat there trying to be composed for his sake. My father never liked seeing worry on anyone's face. He believed it was a burden people shouldn't have to carry for one another. So I held everything in, pretending I was ready, even though I wasn't. The doctors came in and out, speaking softly, their expressions giving away what their words tried to cushion. My father listened to them without flinching. He had always faced the truth head on, never hiding from it. When the night grew quiet and the hallway lights dimmed, he told me he was tired. Not in a defeated way, but in a peaceful one. as if he had finally decided that he had done enough in his time here. There were moments he drifted in and out of sleep, and I found myself memorizing the rise and fall of his chest, terrified of the moment it might stop. I kept replaying old memories in my mind, him teaching me how to fix a loose cabinet hinge, the two of us sitting at the dining table on cold mornings, the way he'd pat my shoulder when he didn't have the words to comfort me. Those small, ordinary moments suddenly felt like treasures. When the monitors finally went quiet, everything inside me went still. I didn't cry right away. It was as if a part of me refused to accept that the world could continue moving when he no longer existed in it. I stayed beside him long after they covered him, holding on to the edges of the moment, unwilling to let it slip into the past. Losing him exhausted something deep in me, emotionally, mentally, even physically. I walked out of that hospital feeling hollow, like someone had carved out the center of who I was, and that exhaustion followed me all the way to the funeral. Long before the second heartbreak revealed itself. In the days leading up to the funeral, everything around me felt fragile, as if the world had turned into thin glass that could shatter with the slightest pressure. I kept telling myself it was just the grief, that my senses were heightened because I was stretched thin, but there was something else lingering in the background, something I couldn't quite name. It showed up in small moments, quiet ones, the kind that are easy to dismiss when you're already overwhelmed. My wife moved around the house differently. She wasn't loud or dramatic. She was simply elsewhere. I'd find her standing in the kitchen, staring at the same spot on the wall, not noticing I had walked in. When I asked if she was okay, she would blink quickly, force a smile, and say she was just tired. And maybe she was. We were both drained by the hospital visits, the long nights, the emotional weight of watching someone you love fade away. But there was a distance in her voice that hadn't been there before. She started taking longer drives to clear her head. Sometimes she didn't answer her phone when I called, and when she eventually returned home, there was always a subtle tension in her shoulders, like she had rushed back or wasn't ready to return. Again, I tried not to overthink it. Everyone handles grief differently, I reminded myself, even though something in my chest tightened each time she brushed past me with that muted energy. There were evenings when she'd sit beside me on the couch, but her body angled slightly away, as if her thoughts were somewhere I couldn't reach. She'd ask how I was holding up, but her eyes drifted, unfocused, not really waiting for the answer. I chalked it up to the exhaustion we shared, telling myself she was just trying to stay composed for me. I appreciated the effort, even if it felt strangely hollow. The night before the funeral, she said she needed to step out for a bit. No explanation beyond, "I need some air." I watched her grab her keys, her movements quick and slightly shaky. I wanted to ask her to stay, to tell her the house felt unbearably quiet without her, but I didn't. I assumed she needed space. You see, space, and I was too emotionally drained to question anything that wasn't directly in front of me. When she returned, she went straight to the shower, avoiding my eyes as she walked past. Her clothes smelled faintly of cologne that didn't belong to me, subtle, barely noticeable, something I dismissed as being picked up from wherever she had gone. I remember telling myself not to make grief heavier by adding suspicion to it. Still, something unseen pressed against the edges of my awareness. Something small, something quiet. A feeling, not a thought, that something in the air between us had shifted. I didn't know why. I just knew the air felt different, and I couldn't yet understand how those little cracks would eventually reveal the truth waiting on the other side. The funeral hall felt heavier than the air outside, as if everyone who stepped through its doors carried a piece of the weight that had settled on my chest. Soft murmurs floated through the room, blending with the muted rustling of clothes and the faint scrape of chairs being shifted. The lighting was dim, intentional, casting gentle shadows across the framed photos of my father arranged near the front. Someone had placed his favorite flowers beside the podium, white lilies, the kind he used to admire during evening walks. Their scent, soft but persistent, wrapped itself around the space like a quiet reminder of him. Family members began arriving in clusters, My cousins, who I hadn't seen in months, hugged me with a mixture of warmth and hesitation, unsure how tightly to hold someone who looked exhausted. Aunts whispered condolences in voices so soft I barely caught the words. Even friends of my father, people whose names I only vaguely remembered, stood before me with eyes that reflected genuine sadness. I nodded, thanked them, tried to maintain the composure that everyone seemed to expect from me, but inside, I felt as if the floor might collapse at any moment. My wife moved differently among these faces. She greeted people politely, but her steps were quick, almost calculated. Whenever someone approached her, she offered a strained smile and an excuse to walk away a moment later. She kept adjusting her sleeves, smoothing her hair, glancing toward the exit as though waiting for something or someone. I tried to tell myself it was just the stress of the day making her restless, but even from a distance I could sense a strange tension in her posture. As more people took their seats, I gestured for her to sit beside me. She hesitated, eyes flicking briefly toward the far corner of the room before shaking her head. "I'll sit near the aisle," she whispered, "in case I need some air." Her voice wasn't shaky, it was controlled, almost too steady for someone attending her father-in-law's funeral. Still, I didn't argue. Grief affects people in different ways, I reminded myself again. Maybe this was hers. The service began with a soft hymn, the kind my father used to hum when he worked in the garage. The music filled the hall, echoing against the wooden walls, pulling memories to the surface I wasn't prepared to face. I kept trying to focus, but my eyes drifted toward where my wife sat. She wasn't looking at me, or the coffin, or the speaker. She kept glancing toward the back door, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her body angled slightly away from the aisle, as if she were bracing for something. People kept approaching me between moments of quiet, offering stories about my father. I listened, or at least tried to, but each time I saw her shift in her seat, each time her eyes flicked toward the entrance, that faint unease inside me grew a little sharper. The hall was filled with grief. But somewhere in that room, another emotion was threading itself into the moment. Something subtle, something I couldn't yet name. He walked into the funeral hall expecting pain, but not this kind of pain, the kind that doesn't stab. It suffocates. The room was dim. The air was heavy. The scent of flowers mixed with grief. And then, in one violent heartbeat, the world slammed to a stop. He saw her, not as his wife, not as the woman he once trusted with his entire life, but as a stranger standing too close to a man who should never have been near her. Especially today. They weren't touching, but they weren't apart either. It was the kind of distance two people share when they've already crossed a line. Her shoulder angled toward him. The man leaned in, speaking softly, too softly for innocence, too comfortably for guilt. A private conversation in a room full of mourning. His pulse froze, his breath thinned. A single violent thought hit him like a hammer. "You brought him here? To my father's funeral?" Wave after wave of disbelief crashed through him, each one sharper than the last. Her fingers brushed the man's sleeve, a tiny movement, barely a second long. But tiny betrayals are the loudest ones. And this one echoed like a scream inside his skull. A cold numbness swallowed him whole. Not rage, not grief. Something darker. The betrayal you don't just feel, you inhale. She saw him then. Her eyes widened. Guilt, raw, sudden, unfiltered, flashed across her face like lightning. She knew, he knew. And all the lies between them evaporated in that instant. But then, the moment that truly carved a scar into him, the affair partner didn't step back. Didn't look ashamed, didn't even blink. He smirked, a small, arrogant curve at the corner of his lips. A silent message. "You can't do anything." That smirk was the slap he never saw coming. Around them, the room shifted. Guests turned, whispers rose. People looked away from the coffin and toward the living betrayal unfolding like a scene no one wanted to witness. He felt humiliation crawl up his spine. Hot, violent. The kind that makes a man question every memory he ever protected. But instead of exploding, instead of yelling, instead of breaking, his soul did something far more unsettling. It went quiet, crystal clear quiet, deadly quiet, a quiet that comes when pain stops shaking and starts sharpening. He looked at his wife with a calm he didn't understand yet, the kind of calm that doesn't forgive and doesn't forget, the kind of calm that ends marriages, not moments. And in that cold silence, he realized this betrayal doesn't deserve a scene. It deserves an ending. The room held its breath. His wife panicked. Her lover straightened, suddenly unsure. But he didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't fall apart. He simply made a silent decision, one that would change everything and leave the entire hall stunned. Because what he did next, no one in that room was prepared for. I don't remember making the decision to follow them. My body just moved almost on its own, as if some quiet instinct inside me refused to let the moment pass unanswered. My steps were slow, almost hesitant, the kind you take when you're afraid of what waits on the other side. The corridor leading out of the hall was dim, washed in a muted gray light that made every shadow feel heavier than it should have been. I kept a careful distance, far enough not to be noticed, close enough to see the outline of their figures ahead of me. A part of me kept insisting there had to be an explanation. Grief does strange things to people, I told myself. Maybe she just needed fresh air. Maybe the man was a distant relative I'd forgotten. Someone offering comfort she didn't know how to accept gracefully. I clung to these thoughts the way someone drowning clings to the first thing that floats, not because it's sturdy, but because it's there. But beneath those soft, hopeful lies, something colder stirred, a tension I couldn't name, a pull toward truth that felt both necessary and cruel. I tried to steady my breathing, but it kept catching, shallow and uneven, as if my chest couldn't decide whether it held sorrow or fear. Each step felt like it dragged a memory behind it. Every late-night conversation, every quiet smile, every small comfort she'd given me during my father's illness. They all flickered like fragile lights in my mind, and with each flicker I wondered if I had misunderstood everything. My thoughts kept splitting into different paths, and every path felt wrong. One whispered that I was overthinking. Another insisted I wasn't thinking enough. A third told me to stop walking, to go back inside and grieve the man I'd lost instead of chasing shadows. But I kept moving, slow and steady, drawn forward by something I couldn't fully explain. Grief and suspicion are a strange combination. One makes the world feel far away. The other makes it unbearably sharp. I could feel both at once, an ache that softened everything and a tension that cut through it. And all the while, I kept telling myself I didn't want to find anything. I didn't want to create another wound on a day already heavy with loss. Yet with every step, the distance between them and me felt more significant. Their silhouettes leaned slightly toward each other, not enough to be obvious, but enough to unsettle me. Enough to make me question whether I'd missed 1,000 small signs in the weeks leading up to this moment. I slowed when they reached the far end of the hallway, stopping just before the door that led outside. They didn't notice me. They were too focused on whatever quiet exchange they were having. I stood there, half hidden behind a column, my heart caught in a space between dread and disbelief. I wasn't ready for answers, but I wasn't ready for silence either. And so I kept watching, waiting, bracing myself for whatever truth I was walking toward. I stopped a few feet before the doorway, close enough to see them clearly, far enough that neither of them sensed me. The hallway light spilled over their faces, soft and revealing in a way that felt almost cruel. They weren't touching at first, just standing too close, talking in low tones. But something in the air between them had weight, a kind of shared familiarity that didn't belong between two people who were supposed to be strangers. I watched her lift her hand toward him, slowly, like it was the most natural gesture in the world. She brushed something off his shirt collar, light, gentle, almost intimate in its simplicity. It wasn't romantic in the obvious sense. It was worse. It was the kind of touch that spoke of history, of comfort, of a connection established long before this moment. My stomach tightened, but I didn't move. I couldn't. He leaned in a little, close enough that they were breathing the same air. She didn't pull back. She didn't even look around to see if anyone was watching. That, more than anything, told me I wasn't witnessing a moment of weakness. I was witnessing a pattern, a truth, something that had lived between them long before today. Their voices were too soft to make out, but their expression said enough. Her face, tired and tense all morning, seemed to soften around him. His posture, casual and familiar, matched hers. She touched his wrist as she spoke, just a few seconds, just enough to feel like a message I was never meant to receive. I felt a strange mix of clarity and disbelief tightening inside me. My father was lying only a few rooms away. People who loved him were grieving, crying, holding each other for strength. And here she was, sharing a moment so undeniably intimate with another man that it hollowed out my chest. I should have stepped forward. I should have said something. But my body stayed anchored to the floor, caught between grief and shock. It was one thing to imagine something was wrong. It was another to see it unfold freely, openly, like it had permission to exist. The man reached out and touched her shoulder, a light tap that lingered just a moment too long. She closed her eyes for a second, not in sadness, not in stress, but in a way that felt like she was letting herself lean into his presence. That small, almost invisible gesture felt louder than any accusation could. My hands were cold, my breathing shallow. The hallway felt too narrow, the walls closing in. I had prepared myself for many things that day. Eulogies, condolences, memories, but not this. Not the quiet confirmation that the woman I trusted had already found comfort in someone else. I didn't walk toward them. I didn't confront. I just stood there in the doorway of the truth I never wanted to see, watching a part of my life collapse in silence. I didn't move. My feet felt locked to the floor, as if the hallway had turned to stone beneath me. The scene in front of me kept unfolding in quiet, intimate motions, but my mind wasn't entirely there anymore. It drifted somewhere else, somewhere softer, calmer, and painfully out of reach. I heard my father's voice, not as a memory I had to search for, but as something that rose on its own, uninvited yet steady. His tone was the same as it had always been when life had tried to overwhelm me. Quiet, patient, grounded. "Don't meet chaos with chaos," he used to say. "You lose the moment you react out of anger. Hold yourself first. The world can wait." It hit me differently now, echoing through the shock, tightening my chest. I remembered sitting with him years ago, frustrated about something small. Work, stress, the typical noise of life. He had placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "People show you who they are in silence more than in arguments." At the time, I thought he was talking about friends, colleagues, never my wife. Another memory surfaced, sharp in its clarity. Him lying in the hospital bed just weeks ago, his breathing slow, his words careful. "Choose what's worth breaking yourself over," he whispered. He said it with tired eyes, but his voice still held the steady wisdom I always leaned on. I didn't think those words would become a lifeline. Standing there in that hallway watching the undeniable closeness between my wife and that man, something inside me froze, not out of fear, not out of weakness, but out of a strange, heavy calm. It wasn't numbness. It was restraint. A voice inside me, his voice, reminded me that once I stepped forward, once I broke the moment open, there was no going back. I could almost feel him beside me, not as a dramatic vision, but as a presence built from years of conversations I didn't fully appreciate until now. My father wasn't perfect. He had his flaws, his quiet battles I learned about only later, but he always carried himself with a dignity that made people listen before he even spoke. I admired that about him more than anything else. My breathing deepened, not steady, but controlled. My hands unclenched without me realizing. Instead of walking toward them, instead of demanding explanations or raising my voice, I stayed still. I watched. I absorbed the truth slowly, painfully, but clearly, exactly the way he would have told me to. "There will be a time to act," he once said, but you'll know it only when your heart stops shaking. Mine was still trembling. So I didn't move. I let the moment show me what I needed to see. And for a brief second, the grief of losing him mixed with the grief of what I was witnessing, forming a quiet, heavy understanding. This was not the moment to confront. This was the moment to breathe. I didn't plan the moment. I didn't rehearse what I would say or imagine how it would unfold. One second I was standing in the hallway, watching them in that quiet, intimate bubble. And the next, my feet simply carried me forward. Not with anger, not with urgency, just deliberate steps, steady and controlled, the way my father used to walk into difficult rooms. They didn't notice me at first. They were still close, still speaking in low tones. But when my shadow stretched across the floor toward them, they both turned. Her face changed instantly. Shock first, then fear, then something that looked like guilt trying to hide behind surprise. The man beside her straightened, as if preparing for confrontation, bracing for the outburst he expected from any husband who'd just seen what I had seen. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand explanations. I just looked at the two of them with a calm that felt foreign but steady. The hallway quieted, the distant murmurs from the funeral service fading behind the heavy walls. It was just the three of us, suspended in a moment none of us could escape. She opened her mouth first. This isn't... Listen, I can explain... I held up a hand gently, not to silence her, but to slow the chaos I knew was coming. I'm not here to argue, I said softly. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything. I just want the truth. The man looked away, his jaw tight, clearly searching for something to say. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't defensive. He simply looked exposed. And she looked like someone whose world had collapsed faster than she could gather the pieces. I didn't mean for you to see that, she whispered. A strange sadness filled me, heavier than the shock. That's not really the problem, I replied. The problem is that there was something to see. Her eyes glossed over, and she reached out instinctively, as if trying to bridge the space between us. I stepped back, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough to let her know I wasn't refusing her out of anger. I was refusing her because something inside me had shifted. The man finally spoke, voice low. I'm sorry. This is complicated. I nodded once. I'm sure it is. They stared at me, waiting for the explosion, the shouting, the emotional collapse they had both rehearsed in their minds. But none of it came. My father's voice, steady, honest, echoed inside me still. And so I stayed calm, composed, present. Right now, I said quietly, my father is lying in that room. Today isn't about any of us. So whatever this is, whatever has been going on, we will deal with it. But not here, and not like this. Her breath hitched. He looked stunned. And for a moment, the hallway held a respect neither of them expected me to command. I didn't yell, I didn't break. I simply walked past them, leaving the weight of their guilt behind me. She followed me only a few steps before the weight of everything seemed to pull her down. Her voice trembled first, barely audible. Please, don't walk away, not like this. When I turned, she wasn't composed or defensive anymore. She looked small, fragile in a way I hadn't seen in years. Her hands shook as she tried to steady herself against the wall, and then, almost suddenly, she sank into a quiet sob that didn't echo. It just folded into the stillness of the hallway. I didn't move toward her. I didn't move away. I simply stood there, watching the truth unravel itself, without effort, without force. She covered her face, but her shoulders trembled with a pain that was no longer about the funeral. It was about being caught, about the truth she could no longer seal behind excuses. The man beside her finally spoke, though his voice carried none of the confidence he had earlier. This wasn't supposed to happen today, he murmured. We weren't planning anything, we were just talking. Talking, I repeated softly, not as an accusation, but as a reflection. The word hung between us, thin and fragile. He looked down, hands clasped, searching for a way to justify something that couldn't be justified. I care about her, he admitted. It wasn't bold, it wasn't proud, it sounded like something he hated himself for saying aloud. It started months ago. We didn't mean for it to get this far. She wiped her eyes, shaking her head. I never wanted you to find out like this, she whispered through her tears. I didn't want any of this to happen today. I'm so sorry. Her voice cracked on the last word and she pressed her palms against her chest, as if trying to quiet her own guilt. I listened. Not because I wanted to hear the details, but because there was nothing left to interrupt. Grief had already drained me, and betrayal had taken whatever strength remained. Why? I asked. The word wasn't sharp, it wasn't bitter. It was tired, an exhale more than a question. She looked up at me, makeup smudged, eyes swollen, guilt etched into every line on her face. I felt alone, she said. You were so wrapped in the hospital visits, the stress, your father's decline. I didn't know how to reach you, and I made the worst choice. The man nodded, as if taking responsibility. I should have stopped it. I should have walked away. I let their words settle. No shouting, no accusations, no dramatic collapse. Just the truth, laid out in the quietest way possible. Bare, unpolished, undeniable. I'm not going to make a scene, I said finally. Not here. Not today. My voice stayed steady, even as something inside me felt like it was dissolving. My father deserves peace. And right now, that's the only thing I care about. She covered her mouth, breaking into another silent cry. He stepped back as if giving the moment the gravity it deserved. And just like that, the truth finished spilling. Not with chaos, but with 3 people standing in a hallway, each carrying their own version of heartbreak. When I turned toward the funeral hall again, the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed everything that had just happened in the hallway. My steps were steady, not rushed, not hesitant, just measured, the way someone moves after accepting a truth they never wanted to face. I didn't look back to see if they were following. I didn't need to. I could hear their footsteps behind me, uneven, timid, carrying the weight of guilt and confusion. The moment I re-entered the hall, a few heads lifted. Relatives with tired eyes, friends offering soft nods, people who had come to honor my father, all of them seemed to sense something was slightly off. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just different. A shift in energy that only grief-trained senses could detect. I took my seat near the front again. The chair felt colder now, as though it had been waiting for me to come back changed. My hands rested on my lap, my breathing controlled. I kept my eyes forward, focused on the framed photo of my father set near the coffin. His smile, calm, kind, felt like an anchor in a moment, when everything else felt uprooted. A few seconds later, she entered the hall. Her pace was slow, her head slightly down. She wiped her face subtly, trying to appear composed, but her eyes were still red, her movements careful. She didn't sit beside me. She hesitated, glanced at me as if asking for permission, but I didn't move or speak. She chose a seat a few rows behind mine. That alone drew quiet attention. The man followed after her, attempting to blend into the background as though invisibility could erase what happened. He found a spot near the back, avoiding every gaze that fell on him. People noticed. They didn't know the story, but the abrupt shift in seating, the silence between us, the tension that lingered like a faint shadow, none of it went unseen. A couple of relatives whispered, exchanging looks that asked silent questions. My aunt stared at me longer than most, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to read what had happened without prying, but no one approached. Maybe it was out of respect for the moment. Maybe it was out of respect for my father. Or maybe it was because the calm on my face didn't match any version of conflict they imagined. They expected anger, confrontation, maybe even an emotional collapse. Instead, they saw a man sitting upright, composed, focusing entirely on the ceremony. That contrast alone shocked them. I could feel the confusion settle around the room like dust. People studied me quietly, unsure whether to comfort me or leave me in peace. And through all of it, I kept my gaze forward. Not out of denial, but because I refused to let betrayal overshadow the last goodbye I came to give. As the service resumed, the room softened again. Grief took its place, conversations quieted. And though my heart was carrying more weight than when I walked in, I remained steady. Not because I wasn't hurting, but because falling apart here, in front of my father, felt like the one thing I couldn't allow myself to do. The days after the funeral didn't feel like days at all, more like long gray stretches of silence stitched together. Time lost its edges. The house felt bigger, colder, as if every sound had been swallowed whole. I moved through it like someone learning to walk again, slowly, carefully, afraid every step would trigger a memory I wasn't ready to face. The suit from the funeral still hung over the chair. I couldn't bring myself to put it back in the closet. It felt like the last untouched piece of reality. Everything else had already shifted. She hovered around the house quietly. No dramatic apologies, no excuses. Just quiet movements, like a guest who wasn't sure if she was allowed to open drawers anymore. Every time our paths crossed, her eyes lowered, part shame, part fear, part something I didn't want to name. I started packing a small bag. Not because I had a destination, but because I needed distance from the suffocating heaviness. A couple of shirts, a charger, my journal. When I zipped the bag up, the sound felt final, like closing a chapter I wasn't prepared to read again. She saw it. Her breath hitched. "Are you leaving?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I answered. And it was the truth. I wasn't leaving to punish her. I wasn't leaving to make her chase me. I just needed space. Air untouched by betrayal. Air where my father's voice wasn't mixed with hers. She stepped forward, then stopped halfway, as if the floor between us was dangerous. "I know you don't want to hear anything from me, but I'm sorry. Not for getting caught, for everything I ruined." Her voice trembled, but I felt nothing. Not anger, not comfort. Just a tired numbness that made it hard to breathe. "I'm not ready for conversations," I said slowly. "Not today. Maybe not for a while." She nodded, tears gathering but not falling. She looked like someone watching a house collapse from the inside, helpless. I walked to the guest room and sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed. It felt like a halfway place, a limbo meant for people who didn't know which direction their life would take next. I stared at the walls, tracing cracks I had never noticed before. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the small sounds of the house, the refrigerator humming, the wind pressing against the windows, her footsteps pacing softly in the hall. She stopped outside my door once. I could feel the pause. The silence stretched, but she didn't knock. Morning came slowly, with a dull light that didn't warm anything. I sat at the kitchen table with black coffee and a hollow chest. She walked in, her eyes red, her voice careful. "What happens now?" I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time I saw how fractured she was. But fractures didn't erase damage. "I need space," I said. "Erase," I said, "not revenge, not drama. Just space." She nodded as if bracing for impact. But there was no impact, just quiet acceptance. As I stepped outside with my bag, the air felt different, heavy but mine. The first breath of a life that hadn't decided where it was going yet, but knew it couldn't stay where it was. The guest room became my temporary shelter, but the real distance was inside me. The silence gave me space, not to escape the pain, but to finally examine it without flinching. Grief has a way of peeling back layers you didn't know existed. And in those slow, heavy hours, I began to understand things I had been too afraid to confront. I thought about my father a lot. Not just the man he was, but the lessons he left behind through actions more than words. He believed trust wasn't something you guarded, it was something you nurtured. "If it ever starts to die," he once said, "it's because someone stopped watering it." I realized how long I had ignored that truth. Somewhere in the last 2 years, something in my marriage had begun to dry out. Not suddenly, quietly. Like a plant wilting in a room you rarely enter. Little moments slipped through the cracks. Delayed replies, distracted conversations, nights where we slept next to each other but felt miles apart. I noticed them. I felt them. I just didn't know what to do with them. Instead of facing the emptiness, I filled it with work, with routine, with the belief that relationships go through phases, and this too was temporary. But silence creates its own gravity, and in that gravity, distance grows. Now, sitting alone in a room that was never meant to be mine, I asked myself the question I had avoided. When did we stop choosing each other? Her betrayal didn't start at the funeral hall. It began long before in moments I dismissed as normal. The truth is painful but simple. Trust doesn't usually shatter. It erodes. Grain by grain, moment by moment, until one day the foundation caves. And yet, as I thought of everything she did, everything she hid, I didn't feel hatred. Hurt, yes. Shock, yes. But beneath all of it was something deeper, clarity. I understood my part in the quiet collapse, not responsibility for her choices, but awareness of how blind I let myself become. I kept assuming things would fix themselves. I kept hoping time would heal something we never treated. My father used to say, clarity comes when life stops shouting and starts whispering. These days felt like whispers. In that stillness, I realized something else. The betrayal wasn't the entire story. It was the loudest part, the breaking point, but not the only truth. There were years before it. Good ones, flawed ones, beautiful ones. We were two imperfect people, trying to build something real, and slowly losing the map. Understanding that didn't make the pain vanish. It made it cleaner, less chaotic, more like a wound I could finally see instead of one I kept touching without looking. For the first time since everything fell apart, I felt grounded, not healed, but steady enough to breathe without drowning. In losing trust, I found clarity. In losing her, I found myself again. And in losing my father, I realized I still carried his lessons. Quiet, steady, waiting for me to notice. The cemetery was almost empty when I returned. A pale evening light stretched across the stones, soft enough to feel like a whisper. No crowd. No condolences. No shadows of what happened that day. Just silence. The kind that lets you breathe for the first time in a long time. My father's grave sat beneath a tall neem tree, its leaves swaying gently, as if greeting me. I walked toward it slowly, not because I was hesitant, but because I wanted to feel every step. Grief taught me that some moments aren't meant to be rushed. The flowers I left earlier had begun to droop. Time moves even when you feel stuck. I lowered myself to the ground, resting a hand on the cool marble. "Baba, I'm here," I said, though no sound left my lips. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt held. For a while, I didn't think about my wife, or the man she chose, or the moment I watched the truth unfold right outside this hall. Instead, I thought about him. My father, his steady voice, his quiet strength, the way he always said, "Dignity isn't how you're treated, it's how you react." I finally understood what he meant. I didn't shout, I told him silently. I didn't break. I didn't become someone I'd regret later. The thought didn't make me proud. It made me peaceful. I let myself breathe out everything I'd been carrying. The betrayal, the confusion, the numbness that came afterward. Out here, none of it felt heavy. It just felt real. And real things can be released. "Baba, I'm not staying in that pain anymore," I whispered inside my head. Not for her, not for anyone. A small breeze brushed my face, gentle, almost reassuring. It felt like a response even if I knew it wasn't. I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my palms. The sky had shifted into a soft gold, the kind of fading light that looks like forgiveness. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel broken. I felt recalibrated. I didn't come here to ask for direction. I didn't come to ask what to do. I came here to let go. And I did. When I turned away from the grave, I didn't look back. Not because I was leaving him behind, but because I was finally ready to step forward. As I walked toward the cemetery gates, the world felt strangely lighter. My father's lessons followed me quietly, like a hand on my shoulder. Soft, steady, guiding. I lost him. And at the same time, I lost a marriage I thought was real. But in this stillness, in this quiet graveyard light, I found something else. Myself. My dignity. My peace. Some endings don't shout. They don't destroy. They don't demand revenge. Some endings simply exhale. And as I walked into the fading evening, I realized this was one of them. If you've made it this far, then you already know how easily a single moment can expose the truth people spend years hiding. Stories like this aren't just about betrayal. They're about the quiet psychology behind what people do when they think no one is watching. And if this one left you with that uneasy feeling in your chest, you're exactly the kind of person who needs to hear the next story. Because every week, there's another life unraveling behind closed doors. Another secret buried under a calm smile. Another relationship held together by lies thin enough to break with a whisper. If you want to understand why people betray, why they pretend, why they choose silence or destruction, then tap into the next chapter on this channel. The stories here don't rely on shouting or revenge. They expose the moments where a person's true nature slips through the cracks. So before you go, ask yourself, do you want comfort or truth? If it's truth you're chasing, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and continue down this path. The next story is darker, quieter, and infinitely more honest.